Hi, everyone, wherever you're joining from the world, across the globe, really. So, morning, evening, afternoon. Like Richard said, we're going to be looking at key insights from the examiner's report using examples. Um, Even if you're taking the exam for the first time or you're retaking this, you would know that the biggest struggle in AA is the application of your knowledge and exam technique. So, the purpose of the session today is using feedback from the examiner's report. We are going to be looking at the difference between a good answer and a poorly written one for key areas of the syllabus, which include risk, internal control, and substantive procedures. If you have any technical questions in terms of the knowledge regarding these, you can, of course, ask them towards the end in the Q&A session. I'm then going to show you how you can apply what the examiners have fed back on using the Study Hub. This is a very important resource, and we'll take this as a learner journey, which can help you prepare for the exam 100% without any additional resources whatsoever. So I'm not just going to be putting up screenshots. I'm just going to take you through one of the topics as a student so you can see exactly how the knowledge really flows. We'll summarize all of this by discussing, like, very briefly, the exam strategies. And then, like Richard said, we are going to have a Q&A where you can ask me any questions that you may have. So we're just going to take this topic wise, making it very exam focused, and of course, putting in all the feedback that the examiners have given. Now, I'm sure you know this already, but in case you didn't, there will always be knowledge-based requirements in the exam. So we have to be prepared. So on an average, this is about 10 marks. In the September-December 24 exam, there were 9 marks of straightforward knowledge-based testing based on components of systems of internal control and benefits of audit planning. These knowledge-based questions are really a straightforward opportunity for you to score marks, and the Study Hub would be a very good resource for you to prepare these properly. So if you are a learner like me who can't really learn things, we're not really talking about rote learning everything word to word. We're just talking about the key points that you need to keep in mind. When you see a knowledge-based question, you need to make sure you read the requirement very carefully and answer what has been asked. A common mistake that is often made is that, for example, in this question, the examiner had asked for benefits of audit planning, and a lot of students ended up discussing things like audit strategy or understanding the client, which were not relevant and therefore did not score any marks at all. Another thing that the examiners have continuously said is that for knowledge-based questions, students are not really developing the point. So they're writing one-word answers, and that ultimately barely gets you half a mark, and sometimes not even that. So please make sure you need to write a full English sentence. We're not talking about any fancy language, but when you're talking about benefits of planning, don't just write time management. You need to explain how that is a benefit. In terms of your exam technique, remember that time management is the key. We need to plan our answers carefully and not over answer when it isn't needed. So if they've asked for 8 risks, at the most write 1 extra, but that's about it. So the examiners are very concerned that you ultimately end up wasting time by writing 10 answers for an 8-mark question, and then that ultimately affects the rest of the exam paper. You should also be using the mark allocation as a guide. In AA, it is normally 1 mark for a clear point. So I genuinely do not think there is any topic across the syllabus where you would get 2 marks for 1 point. Another important thing that the examiners have been continuously sort of pointing out is that for scenario-based questions like risk, internal controls, governance, ethics, etc., the scenario is going to contain more than the required number of points. So like I said earlier, read through the scenario. Even if you've picked up 9 risks for an 8-mark question, just focus on the 8 that you can write really well and move on to the next part. And of course, as always, and as is the case with all papers across the ACCA qualification, the answer to all of this is practice. We're not going to be walking through the practice platform today because we are focusing on the study hub and the practice questions there. But in case you didn't already know this, your practice platform is really the best resource for you to practice your questions in your exam scenario. So you have your questions on one side of the screen, you can type up your answer and apply whatever you've learned as a part of your preparation. Now, like I said at the start, we're going to be talking about the key areas one by one. We're going to start off with the first topic that will always be there in your exam. So this is tested for about 16 marks on average, and this is your audit risk and auditor's response. You get 1 mark for identifying and explaining the risk and 1 mark for the response. Let's start off with the first mark. So when I say identify and explain the risk, there are 2 steps to this. It goes without saying that we have to read the scenario really carefully, but the examiners are concerned that you're skipping through the introductory information. So the opening paragraph does sometimes include a risk. So if this is a new client, if the firm has not audited them before, there is a detection risk due to lack of understanding of the client, and then problems in opening balances as well. So continuously coming up in your report says, examiner's report is, please do not skip the opening paragraph. You get half a mark for identifying the factors from the scenario that give rise to risk. Now, this half a mark on paper sounds really easy because all we have to do is copy paste the risk from the question onto the response area. However, a lot of us as learners and students, we're not doing this properly. Now, listen to this very carefully. If the question says, it's given in the scenario, that the client has spent 2 million on repairs and maintenance, if you just simply copy that as the risk with the full stop, that's a 0. Spending money on repairs in itself is just a fact, it's not a risk. You have to copy the complete part, which is, and that they've included this in property, plant, and equipment. Remember, when we use the word audit risk, we're talking about concerns regarding the financial statements, right? So the concern is not that they spent money, that's up to them. The concern is they've capitalized this in property, plant, and equipment. So all you do is you just copy paste that entire risk and you get half a mark for identification. You then need to explain why it is a risk to the financial statements. So when we talk about the audit risk, it could be a number in the financial statements which is under overstated, like a double entry. It could be a disclosure like a contingent liability disclosure or a non-adjusting event disclosure which is missing. Or it could be a control risk due to, say, new systems that were introduced during the year. So the second half a mark is for explaining the problem or the misstatements that it could cause for the financial statements. So the examiners are concerned that you're either not identifying the risk properly or you're not explaining its impact on the financial statements properly. Like I said earlier, and I know I might sound a bit repetitive, if the requirement has asked for 7 risks, please pick up your strongest risks, reread them from the scenario, make sure you're comfortable with the ID and the explanation, write them down, and then move on to the next part of the question. So the first mark is the identification and the explanation. Now, the second part, which is your auditor's response, is an area that some of you might struggle with slightly. Okay, think of it like this. We'll just take the same example, right? The risk was that the repairs might have been incorrectly capitalized. I'm still at the planning stage. I'm concerned that is incorrect, but that's just an initial concern. I'm not sure yet. Auditor's response is, what's the auditor's plan? How would you as the auditor confirm if it is actually revenue expenditure that has been incorrectly capitalized? So as you think of responses, think of any further written documentary evidence that might be available. Remember, you need to try and focus on better quality evidence. So if the risk is that revenue expenses have been incorrectly capitalized, and you write the response by saying, I'm going to discuss this with the management, that is incorrect. If all your responses are going to be, I'll talk to the management about this, that doesn't really make you a very good auditor. So, an appropriate response would be think of something that can help me confirm the nature of the expense. So, when they would have bought the assets, they would have had invoices. So, my response is I'm going to get a breakdown of the 2 million. I'm going to get those invoices for a sample of them, check the nature of the expenditure. So risk was the problem it might have caused in the financial statements. Response is how I, as an auditor, can actually confirm whether this risk has materialized. So further procedures and try and focus on better quality evidence. For example, like I said, written evidence or third party evidence. Please remember, and this is again something the examiners are saying, you will lose out on marks if your response is incomplete or if it is not relevant to the risk that has been identified. Now, keeping this in mind, I really did want this to be more interactive with you telling me which learner had given the right answer, but I'm conscious of time, so I've just put this in myself. Let's just read through this as a learner. So the first one, learner A, has identified the risk properly. So they've said that the company spent 2.4 million, which is in the property, plant and equipment. And they've said assets are overstated. Now, a lot of you might think that's correct. In reality, you've lost the second half a mark. It is because you have to specify which assets. You have to write property, plant and equipment would be overstated. So the difference between the response given by learner A and B is the second half a mark. In terms of the auditor's response, learner A has said all revenue expenditure should be expensed off. That should be expensed. I'm sorry, I just saw that it says expenses. Expensed off in the statement of profit or loss. That's not your plan. That's basically literally just the accounting treatment. So remember, the response is I need to talk about what my further plan is. So I'm going to get a breakdown of the 2.4 million. I'm going to look at the invoices and confirm that they're of a capital nature. So this is the difference between like a half a mark answer and a 2-mark answer. The reason why, and this is by the way all from the examiner's report, right? The reason why examiners give this feedback is that as students who are well prepared, I would say, of course I picked that up. Of course I wrote assets were overstated. I'm not sure why I'm not getting the marks. So it's really just the specific details which are missing, because of which you could potentially be losing out on marks. Have a quick look at another one, also from the report. Now over here, and by the way, I picked this up intentionally because this comes up quite frequently, fraud, and it's not very well explained. Now, learner A has said there were internal audit investigations which identified an increasing number of differences between the cash register and the cash recorded. The directors will not investigate this because they involve small amounts. Now, you can tell from the terminology, this is copied from the scenario. So the risk is not that fraud has been identified. It's just that the directors are not investigating this further. And then learner A has written, the risk is their misstatements. Now, this is a very generic response. Every risk obviously will lead to misstatements, and therefore, learner A does not get any marks for the explanation. The explanation has to be more specific, and this could be the answer for any fraud in any risk question. When you identify an initial fraud, the risk is this could be a bigger amount, and this also indicates that the client has weak systems because of which fraud occurred, and therefore control risk is higher. So the correct explanation is higher control risk and more fraud. The response for learner A was partially correct. You can't simply write professional skepticism has to be increased, because that has to be done regardless of whether there's a risk, right? Professional skepticism is really what makes me the auditor. So the correct or the complete response is, my plan is I'm going to be more alert to problems, which means increase professional skepticism, but I'm also going to increase substantive testing of cash balances. So the key word is increased testing of cash balances. And logically, it makes sense because when systems are weak, we can't rely on them. And we do have to increase our substantive testing. So with risk and risk response, please be very careful when and you can do this because you still have a couple of weeks before the exam. You do this at your practice phase as well. Have I identified the risk completely? So someone who hasn't seen the question, can they actually tell what the risk is simply by reading my answer? That's a complete risk. And then have I explained why it's a risk? Which specific part of the financial statements could be under overstated? And do I have an appropriate response which is relevant to this risk, which is really the auditor's plan of what they would do next? So do not move on to the next risk until you've made sure all of this is completely covered. So risk with risk response, on an average about 16 marks in every single exam attempt in section B. Anything that comes up in section A, which is your OT questions, is going to be in addition to this. So something that you can, of course, look at once you review the slides later on as well. Now, the next part of your syllabus, which is, again, always there, on an average about 14 to 16 marks, is internal control. There's a number of ways this is tested. In the September-December exam, they really did test both the complicated ones. So there were two different requirements. We're going to be looking at each of these, the techniques, what to keep in mind, and everything in just a minute. But the first one was you had to read through the scenario, identify and explain direct controls for 1 mark, and then describe test of controls to confirm those for another mark. Then another part, you had to look for deficiencies. Again, look at the requirement. That itself tells you how the marks are going to be broken down. Identify and explain deficiencies in the systems given in the scenario, and give a relevant recommendation for another mark. So again, very typical questions that you would see in a AA exam. Let's start off with the first one, which is your direct controls. I'm going to sort of forget for a few seconds that we are studying AA. We're just going to think of this in pretty much layman terms. Direct controls are simply the good parts of the systems. So you read through the question, you look for things that the client is doing correctly, the strengths really that will help prevent or detect misstatements in the financial statements. So when I'm reading the question to look for direct controls, I'm looking for what seems to be done right. So the good parts or the strengths of the system. For identification, please make sure, similar to risk, you copy paste the exact direct control from the scenario and explain why it is a control that the auditor can rely on. The examiners have continuously said in their examiner's report that you're not identifying it correctly. I'll give you another example. So this is something that comes up quite a lot in your sales system. A student has written that the credit control department sets a credit limit, full stop. So they've copied that from this question. That's a 0. That's not a direct control. Setting limits and just forgetting about them or not getting them improved is not a strength in itself. You have to copy the complete information. They set credit limits, so they do credit worthiness checks, set credit limits, and ultimately, this is reviewed and authorized by senior officials. That's my identification. then why is this a good thing for the business? Remember, you have to explain what the good part is for the business. Simply writing, this prevents fraud and error is a zero. You have to be specific about the benefit. So this would lead to lesser chances of bad debts for the business. Literally, that sentence will get you the remaining half a mark. So identify the good parts when we talk about direct controls. Explain why they are good for the business. Then in the second column, we have to test these controls. You've explained the strength and the implication of why it's a strength. You now need to test to confirm it. Again, this is very logical. When you're at the client and they tell you how amazing their system is, on paper, it sounds really good, but I have to confirm that it is actually being followed, or it has actually been implemented as I was told. So test of control is confirming the operating effectiveness. In other words, confirming whatever they've said to me is actually happening. When you think of ways to test that control given in the question, you can start off with thinking about any documentation that can be tested. Explain what documentation you're testing and the purpose as well. So in my earlier example, the control was credit limits are set and reviewed by a senior official. The document that you can think of is the form. When you obviously do a credit worthiness check, it's not done on paper, it's not done on the phone. There would be a proper form, so you can take a sample of those forms and check that they were reviewed and authorized by senior officials. If there's no document that you can see, obviously, then you can maybe look into inquiry or observation. Observation should really be the last option because that's the weak test of control. So, for example, if you've done your past exams, the control is that junior officials cannot access the payroll master file. So you could go to someone junior in the department and ask them to try and access the payroll master file. That's an okay answer for observation. But if there were other better options available in terms of documentation or inquiry, I would go for those. So 1 mark for identifying and explaining the strengths or the good parts, and then another mark for explaining the test of control. Again, some examples from your examiner's report. Learner A has not identified the complete control. They've simply said all new customers apply for a credit account. This prevents fraud and error. And they've given an irrelevant test of control, which is try and set up a credit limit yourself. Both are incorrect, and this is a complete zero. The complete control is the complete control or the direct control is it's set up, it is regularly reviewed. This decreases the chances of irrecoverable debts. And the test of control would be, I would inspect your credit applications and make sure they've been reviewed or approved by senior officials. The next part is your deficiencies and recommendations. Now, when we do a question on deficiency, we are talking about the weaknesses in the system. I'm not going to repeat myself. Again, when you identify the deficiency from the system, make sure it's the correct one and it's explained properly. So, by the way, normally these questions are quite long, but don't worry too much about this because the questions are always given in a very logical flow. So you can actually read a paragraph, pick up a deficiency, and then move on to the next paragraph. So another thing that the examiners have said is be alert to what is missing in the scenario. So for example, this is not from your September-December exam, but something that has happened quite a lot in the past is in purchase systems, they will often say that a supplier statement reconciliation is carried out and filed away. Now, this is a deficiency. Even if you're carrying out the supplier statement reconciliations on a monthly basis, filing it away is not the answer. You have to look at the reconciling items and investigate them. So make sure the deficiency that is absent is also picked up. So the fact that it wasn't reviewed made it a weakness. And then, of course, make sure that you explain the so what. So if it is not reviewed on a monthly basis, we will not be able to identify any errors in the payables or the purchase amounts. We won't know if there are any differences. The recommendations that you would give are pretty much linked to your deficiency. Just make sure they are relevant and they are practical. So in my example, the recommendation would be the reconciliations should be reviewed by a senior official so that follow-up actions can be taken on the differences that have been identified. Again, this is like a simpler version of what wrong recommendations could look like. Learner A has identified, and A and B have identified the deficiency correctly. So the purchase department does not have access to the GRNs, which means they will not be able to confirm if the orders have been fulfilled. So they raise the order. If you don't tell them they've received it, how would they know that the order has been completed? Now, learner A has given a recommendation to say, give the purchase department access to review GRNs, they will get half a mark. The complete recommendation is they should review the GRNs and follow up on unfulfilled orders. So if you're a student who is retaking this exam, please remember it's potentially not your knowledge that's a concern. It could really just be your application or your answering techniques that are missing. The next part that I wanted to speak about before I move on to the study hub is substantive procedures. You are going to need to use the study hub to prepare for these, particularly if you're a learner who's not working in audit. So that would be my starting point and tell you how. But whatever you've understood and learned has to be tailored to the scenario. The examiners are very concerned that you're just rote learning stuff and copy pasting it, and you're ultimately not getting any marks at all. You have to read the requirement very carefully. Sometimes they specifically ask for assertions. So substantive procedures on completeness only or valuation only. So you then have to make sure that you only write the relevant answers. The biggest concern is regarding the completeness of your answer. Please make sure to get the 1 mark, you need to complete the source document and the purpose. So for recoverability, I'm inspecting the post-year-end bank statement. Why? Because I want to confirm and see if any money has been received from the receivables. You should not be writing written representation as a substantive procedure unless it relates to an area which involves estimation. I'm going to be picking up accounting estimates as something to walk through the study hub as well, but we all know things like provisions and fair values, they are risky, they would require written representation, but just don't use it for other areas where better quality evidence is available. Something for you to sort of quickly read through as we go along. If you've simply written review disclosures, you're potentially getting half a mark or 0. You need to explain why you're reviewing them. You're looking at them to make sure that the disclosure requirements of provisions have been met. So complete the purpose as well. If you're simply writing, obtain a management representation regarding the provision, that's incomplete. You have to explain the purpose. You need to evaluate the reasonableness or the completeness of the provision. So as I'm writing the answers to substantive procedures, make sure you're covering the source document as well as the purpose. A commonly made mistake regarding existence, if you're simply writing physically verify property, plant, and equipment to confirm existence, that is still half a mark because you haven't mentioned the source document. So your complete answer would be select a sample from the non-current asset register and physically verify this for existence. This is not something that I'm going to talk through in this session. I actually annotated this for you to look at later on. This was tested in the September-December exam. The examiner's feedback was this was not done well at all. This is what I meant by tailoring your answer. This was a not for profit organization. The requirement was your procedures on income, and they had said in the last line that completeness and cutoff has been identified as a key risk. I'm going to step back for a second and think there is no GDN, there is no sales order over here. This is an organization receiving donations, etc. You read the paragraphs very carefully. There are three types of income given. You need to draft or tailor procedures for each of them separately. The key point to remember is when I want to confirm completeness, my starting point is always the source document. So for my bank donations, my initial document would have been the sign-up document. So sign-up document to the bank statement and ledger to my income details. So again, I'm using the same rules that are there for completeness, but tailoring them to the scenario given. So once you've seen your question and answer for September, December, come back to this slide and see how easy it is to come up with the answer in terms of drafting the procedures for this. So just very quickly wrapping up, for controls, risk, and substantive procedures, be very careful that you're following the answering techniques by writing down the complete answers. I am now going to be talking about the study hub. Now, if you're a learner who's not tuition-led, so you're not studying with any learning provider, your study hub really is 100% preparation for your AA exam. It gives you the knowledge, it gives you the technique, and ultimately, through the practice platform, it will make sure that you're ready for your exam as well. Now, in terms of AA, my first step has to be the knowledge. I'll show you how you can use the study hub to learn new things. So even if you've never worked in audit, you can get all your knowledge from the study hub. There are quizzes at the end that I'm going to show you, which will help you evaluate your understanding of the topic. You then can apply the answering techniques that I spoke about and the examiners have written about by using the practice area. And then you can evaluate your exam readiness by practicing on the practice platform that we won't be looking at today. However, I am going to walk you through the study hub for steps 1, 2, and 3 to tell you how you can use this 100%. I'm just going to take a few seconds because I need to share my screen just to quickly point out, like Richa said at the start, you will be, because I'm sharing my screen now, you will be able to see my screen by clicking on the media player. So I'm just going to do this as we talk. Okay, there you go. So you should be able to see my landing page when I enter AA's study hub. Now, post this session, I realized, oh my God, accounting estimates was something that I'm not too comfortable with. And by the way, as a tutor, accounting estimates are always there. It could be in risk, it could be in procedures, it could be any part of the syllabus. So your study hub, I'll just start off with showing you everything. On the left-hand side of the screen, you have your chapters. You have your flashcards, which are really one-line revision of the key concepts. So you have really good flashcards over here for all the key concepts, and you can use them to revise. There are 114 terms that you can revise. You've forgotten what professional skepticism is. Affaf used that today. I'm going to click it and see what that means. You have quizzes. I'm going back to the right-hand side of the screen. These quizzes will also be there when you're studying through your chapters. And then you have practice questions that I'll talk you through when I've read through the first chapter. So on the chapters tab again, I'm going to scroll down and I'm now going to be looking at chapter 17, which is accounting estimates. Your knowledge starts off really well. It gives you a summary or an overview of what's going to be covered. This is basically a checklist that you can use as your learning outcome. By the end of it, have I covered all of this? So as I start reading this step by step, if you know what an accounting estimate is, you'd skim through this and move on to the next one. I read through all of this. I was very happy to see that I'm comfortable with all the examples of accounting estimates here. These are all examples that come up in the AA exam, and I need to be prepared for the procedures in just a little while. Now, as I was reading this line, they've mentioned something count estimation uncertainty. I'm going to use the highlight tool right at the top and highlight this. So if you look at the where my cursor is, there's a calculator and there's a highlight function. So this will stay for me to come back to after I've completed my revision, my initial knowledge as well. I moved on to the next part, which was my next part of your area. I'm just going to unclick this now, and it's stuck. Okay. Why is it not moving to the next part? Hang on. I think it's basically my cursor, which is now stuck. Hang on, guys. See, I knew this would happen. If I'm doing this at this point in time, something was going to happen. Why is it not moving on? Okay, I'm just going to refresh this. Just give me a second. I'm hoping it'll come back on. Okay, I'm back to the study hub. And do this later. Okay, so there you go. So I was here. So I've gone to so I highlighted whatever information I wanted to highlight. I'm moving on to the next one, which is determination. And this is really, really important. So as I was reading through this seemed like new content for me. I'm going to go over here, look at the cursor. You can actually make notes over here. So I'm going to, this is information that I didn't know. I'm going to talk about how complex my some of my estimates are, and I'm going to add this to my information, and I'll tell you how I can come back to this later on. So as you're reading the information, stuff that you're comfortable with, just retain that. Stuff that you think is new or difficult, use the highlight function, use the notes, and you can create a bookmark as well. So when I moved to my next portion, which was planning, this is where my risk answers are going to come from. So again, I'm going to use the bookmark tool over here, and this has been bookmarked for me to come back to later. When I finish this entire account estimation part of the syllabus, this tells me I've now actually covered the problems associated with audit and review of accounting estimates. I'm going to rate my confidence as medium. I have highlighted a few points that I want to come back to, and they will be bookmarked. I'll show you where they are. But I'm not done with my preparation yet. Remember, the examiners are saying knowledge is just the starting point. It is the application which is the problem. So I'm going to click on practice on my left-hand side of the screen. This is all topic-wise. I'm going to go down, scroll down, and go to chapter number 17, which is what I was doing. And there is a question on estimates. I'm going to start my practice. I'm going to plan my answer. I'm going to read the question. I'm going to plan my answer in terms of matters and the risk that is there. When I confirm it, my answer comes up. The standard solution comes up. So my answer was matters and risk. It's right at the top here. I can actually compare it with the standard solution and see where I've gone wrong. So this is what we mean by application of your knowledge that you've learned through the study hub. I'm done practicing. I'm going to click this. When I go back to my chapters, right at the top, the notes that I made for my estimates are there. The points that I bookmark for planning to come back to, that is still there. So this is really just the entire learning environment that I can use to learn and apply my knowledge 100%. So this is something that I found really useful as a learner, particularly as someone who's not really used to reading a lot of content, because I find it just too monotonous. So doing it step by step in smaller screens, making notes as I go along, using the calculator if I need, and ultimately you're completely prepared by the end of this. Remember, you will still need to go to the practice platform to practice additional questions in exam environment. Those questions are in addition to what are covered in the practice area. Just to sum up, this is not something that I haven't said before. This is like a summary of what you need to do. At this stage, if you've covered the syllabus, please make sure you're revising actively. You can use content on the study hub. You can make your own mind maps or flashcards. You should practice as much as you can. You should be comfortable with the mark allocation. You should read the solutions very carefully. Please do not miss the solutions. That's how you will understand what you've missed out on. You need to make sure you practice full exam questions. You can use the September, December 70 mark section to practice this and identify your weak areas. Go back to the study hub to practice whatever you're not comfortable with. During the exam, please do not overwrite and please do not spend too much time on a question that you're not comfortable with. Even if you know a question partially, do bits of it, move on to the next one. Don't just keep thinking about this. Use about 1.8 minutes as the rule for each mark and move on to the next one. And don't forget what we said: identification, explanation, implication. For substantive procedures, I have to write the source as well as the purpose. And with this, and very spot on, we're now going to be moving on to Q&A. I'm sorry I couldn't make it more interactive during this session because I was slightly conscious of not being able to cover all the content. But I hope you were making notes of everything, all the questions that you had. You need to send them in the Q&A part and we'll answer them as I see them now. So I'm going to start off with the first one. So please tell us how, oh, hang on, that's gone up. I was reading, hang on, I'm just going to scroll down. Okay, so there was a question, I think that's just gone up. How much time should I spend on each section? I think Shayan asked that. I would say please allocate about 1.8 minutes per mark, including the reading time. So for a 10-mark question, you should spend 18 minutes in total. And I think you should do it for each part, not just each question, but each part, because that sort of makes me disciplined and makes sure that I don't miss out on any of the parts. Even if you do know the answer really well, do not spend more than 18 minutes and move on to the next one. 1.8 minutes is the time available. I normally play safe and say 1.5 minutes. So whatever you're more comfortable with. Okay, so we have another question from Daniel. When we are asked about substantive procedures for any general item, for example, receivables, should we only write the procedure or are we also required to mention the assertion that the procedure confirms? You can't really write a complete answer without mentioning the assertion. However, if you're wording your procedure in a way that covers the purpose automatically, that should be okay. So for example, if you write, inspect the post year-end bank statement to see if any money has been received from the receivables, that's 1 mark. You haven't used the word valuation, but you've covered the purpose and the source document, so you still get 1 mark. So as long as you are covering the purpose and the source, you don't always have to write the assertion that has been tested. So Whitney has asked whether we should do section A or section B first. I would say section A, spending 1.5 minutes on each question, for each mark. So for a 10-mark question, which is your first OT case, spend 15 minutes, move on to the next one, 15 minutes, move on to the next one. I always recommend section A. Again, as long as you're disciplined in your time allocation, it really isn't matter what you do. But I would always recommend section A. Okay, Krish has asked if it's important to use international standards on auditing, ISAs. In AA, no. There are definitely no marks for writing the ISA or IS numbers, but there are not any extra marks for talking about what the standard says either. So, as far as AA is concerned, as long as you're explaining the risk properly, you don't need to explain what the accounting treatment is. As long as you're writing the procedures, etc., properly, you don't need to refer to the ISA at all. So again, I think that answers Viraj's question as well. You do not need to mention any accounting standard at all. There are no additional marks for this. So in my answer earlier, Viraj, they have capitalized this. The risk is this is incorrect. Property, plant, and equipment is overstated. That's a complete mark. Even if you write anything extra, you won't get any marks for that. I had Noor who said, may I know how many marks are provided for substantive procedures questions? On an average, about 20 marks across the entire paper. It's definitely more than 20, by the way. There's about 20 in section B, and then section A has its own substantive procedures. So 20 is the minimum. So you can't really, pass without knowing your substantive procedures. So I have another question regarding section B. Are there any questions where half a marks are awarded for each correct item, or is it just one or two? No, Tomas, it is, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, it is half a mark division as well. So if you've identified the risk or the direct control correctly, but not explained it, you will still get half a mark. So when you go back through my slides, I broke it down into half a mark to tell you that you can get half a mark for correct identification, even if the implication is incorrect. Okay, Steffi has asked a very good question. If the examiner has asked for 5 points, and if I write 6 points and one of the points can be wrong, will they consider the 6th point as valid? Absolutely yes. So across the entire exam, the markers will keep marking until your answer is finished or the maximum marks are achieved. So you will keep getting the marks. The drawback would be, I don't want you to write too many extras, but to answer your question in one word, yes. You will get the mark for the 6th one, no matter what position it is at. Okay, so how do you get a risk when you read the story or the information given? This comes partially from practice and partially from understanding what audit is. Just remember the key point. The client would try to show extra assets and income, so overstate assets and revenue, and they would try to understate liabilities and expenses. So when you read the information the first time, that's the first thing that should come to your mind. Is there any indication that they've tried to book an asset which is not really an asset, or maybe recognize income too early? So that's the first really point that should come to your mind. Sanjana has a very good question. How should we ace multiple choice questions or OT questions? Honestly, there's no additional practice needed. If you cover the syllabus, attempt all pass exam questions, you're good to go. However, during the exam, do not rush through this. Some of my very good students have struggled to get through the OTQs simply because, I normally don't use the word, but overconfidence. Oh, I've read the question, I know what the answer is, I'm not reading all the options, this must be the right one. So don't rush through it. Spend about 15 minutes on each OT case, because that will make sure that you've read through the scenario very carefully. Oh, a very good question over here. I'm not going to try and pronounce your name. I might mispronounce it. But can we get auditors' responses from the substantive procedures? Absolutely yes. Can I just say, at the planning stage, you've identified the risk. The response would either be, look at the systems on this area, or it would be, most of the time, these are the substantive procedures I'm going to do. Or if it's a going concern issue, then I look at this at the going concern review stage. So most of the responses come from your substantive procedures anyway. Okay. Cher has asked, can we use answers using tables? Absolutely yes. For risk, internal controls, and corporate governance weaknesses, and for ethics if it comes up in section B. You should be using tabular forms. You'd see this in your standard answer as well. By the way, sometimes they give a pre-formatted template. So sometimes the table would be given and you'll have to fill in the table with your answer. Okay, I have another one. I'm just going to scroll up. That seems like a very good one. Again, from Tomas, it was mentioned that inquiry would be a better test of control than observation, but inquiry by itself is not audit evidence. It was meant to be used in combination. Absolutely, yes. 100% agreed. See, this is what we're going to do. We're going to see the first one is a document that I can look at if there is no document at all. So, in my example, where the control was that juniors cannot access the master file, there's no documentation involved. Now, the next option would have been inquiry or observation. In my answer, observation is better because I can see this myself. But in terms of inquiry used in isolation, that is absolutely correct. It's not, it is evidence, but it's weak evidence. So for test of controls, you should use it in combination with something else. So with something else would either be again inspection or observation. But most of the time, if you found a document to inspect, you don't need to go on to inquiry anyway. So inquiry in itself is weak evidence. It cannot be relied upon. Absolutely agreed. Okay, another question. I also come across ensure a lot, but as far as I know, the auditor does not ensure but confirm or challenge management of the financial statement, and it is management is the one who ensures. Could this please be clarified? Okay, so in terms of the AA exam, you can write either review, ensure, check, confirm, challenge, as long as the rest of the answer is correct. In practical life, we don't ensure anything. There is no absolute assurance. We can't really even confirm anything. We're just verifying. But as far as your answers are concerned, when you're writing down the answers, you could write ensure, review, confirm. All these three words are a zero if they're not followed on by a correct procedure. So I could write review or check the post-year and bank statements, or in terms of any other area. Ensure is a word I would generally avoid, but it's not like a zero as long as the rest of the sentence is correct. Because over here, we're using that as an English word rather than an audit term. How do we revise audit notes? I would say audit notes. I would say use the study hub to revise the key summaries, really. That should be sufficient at this point in time. Oh, Isha has said the trick to revise what we spoke about in terms of the risk questions. Read the scenario, pick up the information in the scenario, which makes you think there could be higher chances of misstatements in an area of the financial statements. Explain that area. So use the copy paste function to copy the entire risk, the relevant portion, onto your response area for half a mark, and then explain which portions of the financial statements are affected. And for responses, you have to think of further work that the auditor is going to do on that area. Okay. Mason has said that any tips for preparing internal control? I feel my practice on the subject is very slow. Can I tell you something? I don't know if I should be saying this, but every single internal control deficiency or direct control that was tested in September, December 24 was something that has already been tested in the past exams. So the only way to prepare internal controls is through practice. I can give you maybe absolute assurance if you cover all the practice questions on internal controls, read the solutions, you'll pick up the trend or the thought process really. So it's always the same problems that are tested over and over again. So the answer to this is just really practice and nothing else. I have another question. When we're asked about substantive procedures for, oh, we've done that, right? Oh, so yeah, I forgot to tick that off. That's been answered. I'm just going to scroll up. We've already mentioned you don't need to mention ISA names. Oh, that's a long one. Khushi has said, I'm very confident about the syllabus preparation and my paper went really well. I completed 100%, was confident that I would pass and get a good score, but I got 42. I have no idea where I got wrong. Hushi, if you had the knowledge and your exam went well, then it's what we discussed in the session today. So you were probably not writing the specific implications that were required to get the mark. So this time around, when you do the mock exam, please make sure that you match your answer stepwise. Did my identification match the standard solution of the weakness? Did I explain the weakness properly? Is my recommendation relevant and complete? 42 means you have the knowledge, but you're not following the answering techniques to sort of put that knowledge on paper. Kimberly has another question. When giving a recommendation for internal controls, do we use inspect, observe, inquire, re-perform, recalculate, or reconciliation, verification, segregation of duties? There is no checklist that you can use. Test of controls. Controls can be tested through inspection, inquiry, observation, and a combination of these. So it has to be very relevant to the control that you are testing. You will not look at a reconciliation in test of controls. If you are recalculating something, that's not a test of control. So you have to be very clear on the difference between a test of control and substantive procedures. You will not re-perform anything in a typical test of control. You'll have to see if the client is doing it properly. Richa, I was just wondering, is it okay for me to answer more questions? There are quite a few. Or do you want me to stop? I'm happy to do either way. I think, Richa, are you on mute? I think, or maybe I can't hear you. Oh, yeah, that's fine. I'll just take one more while Richa is setting up. Anise has said, as rote learning, no, there's no rote or knowledge questions. Do we have to write in professional or normal language? You can write in normal language. Just write the benefits of planning. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. Just write the components of internal control. But when you're explaining them, you'll have to stick to technical terms. So you will need to talk about control environment. You can't rephrase the word control environment. And no, there is no negative marking in any part of any ACCA paper, by the way. So, Malika, there is no negative marking in substantive or any other paper or any other question, really. Sorry, Richa, over to you.
You can hear me now.